Thanks, Dr. Kavanaugh. And thank you all for being here. This is exciting. We didn't know what to expect, and this is way beyond our expectations. So we hope we have a few interesting things to say and we can have a good discussion. When John and I sat down thinking about this afternoon, we thought about what a change it has been since the beginning of this project in 2009 to where political discourse was at that time and where political discourse is today. So that's a bookend that we'd like you to, we're thinking about addressing in our remarks. And maybe you can think about that too if you can remember back that far to 2009. That's when we started this project. Father Garanzini, who was our president at that time at Loyola, invited me. I was head of directing the Hanks Center for Catholic Studies to do a project on kind of world Catholicism. And the thought was at the time, let's look at the democratization of the world. Because remember at that time, you've got Arab Spring, you have Occupy Wall Street. There was a kind of populist, progressive, democratic movement going on, although it was 2008, the financial crisis had occurred. But there was a kind of a sense of grassroots optimism about progressive democratic movements. And we picked that up as we went around to the different parts of the world where this project was engaged. Well, you know, we are at quite a different place now. And we're wondering if the voices that are speaking in this text can still speak to us, or whether they're in a sense an echo of some past era. As things went forward in our project idea, we thought of integrating culture into the mix, this kind of intersectionality between democracy, culture, and Catholicism. Because part of Samuel Huntington's thesis at that time, and if you recall the Clash of Civilizations and then the third wave of democratization, was this sense that Huntington had of, you know, as we proceed, we're going to have this clash of Western Christian culture, Middle Eastern Islamic culture, and Chinese kind of, you know, Confucian culture, that these cultures were going to be increasingly kind of coming to loggerheads. But he also noted the phenomenon of democratization in Eastern Europe. That was important to him. At the same time, Pope Benedict was writing Caritas and talking about consumerism and violence in culture. So for a number of reasons, we then merged cultural questions of religion, of consumerism, of violence with democratization, and where the Catholic community or Catholic Church was with that. Then the question came, well, who do we involve or who do we invite? And there it was a matter of trying to leverage Jesuit universities around the world. So the Jesuits have over 250 universities around the world. They're the largest, they run the largest higher educational system on the planet. And they've never leveraged that. Most of their universities are relatively autonomous. So our president was saying, you know, is there some way we can begin to leverage Jesuit universities worldwide to share a project? So we already had a relationship with Sanata Dharma University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So we invited scholars from there to participate, and several were willing. We had at Loyola a relationship with Ruiz Montoya University in Lima, Peru. Several scholars there were willing. We had scholars from Fordham and from Seattle U and from our own shop at Loyola that wanted to participate. And then there was an appeal from the provincial of the Lithuanian Jesuits. Lithuania had been 10 years out from under Soviet control. And the Jesuits, who had originally founded the university in Vilnius and had it, you know, taken away when they were suppressed, and the university having been controlled by Soviet, organization for 30 years, was now a place where the Jesuits, who had a lively community in Vilnius, to kind of return and offer courses in the history of the church and ethics. So they invited us to come and involve Catholic intellectuals in this project as kind of a first attempt to kind of reinvigorate Catholic scholarship in Lithuania. So anyway, we started the project by soliciting applications for research. We ended up with 31 or 33 people involved with the project. So, and it was from 4 countries, about 18 or 19 different academic disciplines, 3 religions. There were Jewish scholars, there was a couple Muslim scholars and Catholic scholars. We had quite an interdisciplinary and multicultural group. And we invited them to really write under this broad umbrella of democracy, culture, and Catholicism, which was very broad, and we got quite an eclectic array of interesting papers that then John and I had to figure out some way to bring them together and to bridge them. So that was part of our mission. The project itself, we had everybody come to Chicago in 2010, and we had a big gathering where everybody met one another, and people found out where Indonesia was on the globe. Some people didn't know where that, some of our scholars, like from Peru and Lithuania, did not know exactly where Indonesia was. And some of the scholars from Lithuania and Indonesia did not know that the Peruvians had been fighting with Shining Path, and they didn't know what that meant. And most of the scholars from Lithuania, from Indonesia and Spain and Peru had no idea what the Lithuanians had suffered for 50 years under the oppression of the fascists. And so you would think with these high-level scholars that, these scholars would be aware of just the basics of the situation that Catholics had experienced around the world, but that was not the case. The best scholars in these countries were relatively unaware of the sacrifices and challenges that the peoples in other countries had experienced. So that was the first part, having people simply meet. Then they began working on drafts of their papers, and we had the following year, in 2011, we had what were called regional colloquia. So we had a colloquia in Yogyakarta for a number of scholars. We had a colloquia in Lima, Peru. We split up the group into 3, and we had a colloquia in Vilnius, Lithuania. So we got first drafts presented, and groups like this came, students and public came for these presentations, good discussion. Then the feedback was taken back for the next year, 2012. We all met together in Rome at the Gregorianum. Everybody presented their final drafts. So by the end of 2012, we had the makings of a text. It took a while to get a publisher. Publishers are pretty allergic to edited texts these days. But this was an interesting project, so fortunately, Fred Nachbar at Fordham Press took it on, and that was a wonderful thing. And he worked really closely with us. And it wasn't until 2016 that we had it published. It took quite a while. Some of the scholars in Indonesia and Peru had never written in English before, and had never written at a kind of scholarly level. So there was a challenge of kind of getting things at a common kind of level of discourse. You know how it is with editing texts from different parts of the world. So it was very challenging, but it was a lot of fun. And John was he was a graduate student at the time, and he was just a fabulous collaborator. So that's our book, and there's the cover. That's the Hill of Crosses in Lithuania, and we took it as a kind of symbolic of our book, because that Hill of Crosses has been a symbol of Lithuanian resistance to oppression since the 19th century. Lithuania was under the Russian Empire when it was still the Tsarist regime, and to indicate their cultural uniqueness and their desire for freedom, started already in the late 19th century planting crosses on this hill, a little village about an hour's drive east of Vilnius, closer to the Russian border. And depending on how oppressive the regimes were that the Lithuanians were under, the crosses would be removed by the police. And then in the dark of night, the Lithuanians would sneak back up and put more crosses. And then the next day they'd be taken away, and the next night they'd come back. Well, this was most apparent during the Soviet times, where it was really a battle of wits between the Lithuanian Catholics who insisted on maintaining their integrity and their freedom under the conditions of terrible oppression, with thousands and thousands and thousands of Lithuanians that died under Soviet regime. It's just, I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's just horrendous. But nevertheless, they kept putting crosses up on that hill until finally the Soviets gave up. They said, we're sick of trying to remove these crosses. They don't stop bringing them. So when they did give up, the hill got full of crosses. Now today, if you go there, it's incredible. There's over, you can't count how many crosses there are. There's 100,000 crosses on that hill. And the Lithuanians, some of them are very good at woodworking, use it as a way for them to practice their folk art. So there's lots of really interesting folk art crosses. That is, expressing their culture, expressing their Catholicism, and expressing that urge to have standing in a society, which I think is the heart of democracy. And the vision of democracy is that we have equal standing. And the Lithuanians really crying out for that opportunity to have equal standing in the world. So anyway, that is, let me progress here. Yeah, there's the flag of Lithuania and Peru and Indonesia and the United States. And our question is, are these voices now distant, given our very radically changed political culture? So John is going to talk a bit about we just selected like 3 essays from each chapter. We'll just briefly talk about the thesis that each author brought to the chapter, and we'll move through that and then open it up for discussion.
Okay, well, I just want to reiterate my thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate it, and to Dr. Kavanaugh and to the center here for inviting us to speak. There's one more, yeah. So what I thought I would do, just sort of briefly, is explain to you a little bit about each of these 3 contributions that were made to the book, sort of what was explored within the context of democracy, culture, and Catholicism in the United States, and then sort of pose this question, this age of innocence question: where are we perhaps today in light of some of the changes to our sort of democratic cultural landscape? So the first of the essays was by Bren Ortega-Murphy, who is a professor of communications at Loyola University Chicago. Her essay, her contribution to this book, really explored, rather than sort of taking these themes in very large and broad, sort of sweeping images, she really focused very much on one specific instantiation of democracy, culture, and Catholicism in the context of the United States. And the place that she went to was women religious, so Catholic nuns. And what Bren's argument was that in the United States, the voice of Catholicism, the voice of democracy, the voice of culture, in a very, very significant way, was impacted by women religious, by Catholic nuns, because of course women religious were in charge of the schools that were educating immigrants. They were in charge of the hospitals, tending to the poor. And so Bren's thesis was that actually the kind of culture and democratic vision we get today in the United States, perhaps at least at the point at which she's writing, is that American democracy has been greatly impacted by the Catholic perspective, by the Catholic voice, specifically through women religious. So it wasn't sort of a Rome down type approach, but the women religious came to the US, they formed communities, they attended to the needs of the communities they were in, and from there, we get this rise of sort of a democratic, both democratic participation, because women religious encouraged immigrants to not only be good Catholics, but to be good Americans. And so this social democratizing process was very important. As she said, at the time that the book was published, we had over 150 members of U.S. Congress had been educated by the nuns in Catholic schools. 5, one has passed away since, but 5 of the 9 Supreme Court judges in the United States, we're Catholic, from Catholic education, senators, congresspeople. Nancy Pelosi, who was at the time Speaker of the House but is now Minority Leader, Catholic educated. And so she said, there's something about this education that comes from women religious that really, in her mind, affected the way American democracy operated. Bill O'Neill is a Jesuit who teaches out at Santa Clara, and he wrote a piece looking at restorative justice, which is a way of talking about justice. So there's different forms of justice. Restorative justice being one where there is an attempt to try to bring together victim and offender into community, into collaboration, into dialogue as a way of trying to right wrongs outside of what's more commonly known as a retributive model, right? The punishment model. You've done something bad, you go to jail for it. The restorative justice tries to say, something bad has been done, we need to talk about this, we need to engage, and perhaps there needs to be some punishment, but more importantly, there needs to be a sense of restoration after the fact for both victim and offender. And Bill really took up a lot of the conversations going on, still today actually, and perhaps even more so today, around, say, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the United States, as well as looking around the world to Peru, as we'll talk about in a minute, but also to South Africa, to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with Desmond Tutu, as being sort of this model for a restorative justice that might help the United States address what he took to be, along with scholars like Michelle Alexander and Brian Massingale, this increasing incarceration, this problem of mass incarceration. Finally, Barry Sullivan is a professor of law at Loyola's Law School, and he wanted to explore the question of transparency, perhaps one of the most telling and apropos of the chapters in the book to today, given our current sort of political landscape. Transparency about how, in a democracy, how do citizens participate? Is it that citizens are sort of constantly involved, right? Even between elections, citizens should be consulted. Citizens should voice their opinions, their concerns, their objections. Sort of very Madisonian out of James Madison's vision of democracy. That's one model. Or do we elect our representatives, our presidents, our senators, every 2, 4, 6 years, and then we let them do it? Right? That's what we elect them to do. It's their job. Right? These are the two things that are at play in Barry's piece. And what he says is, this question of transparency, because he prefers the model of James Madison, because he thinks citizens should be involved every day, how do we have an informed, intelligent electorate? Well, they need information. Right? And yes, Barry will defend, and I think accurately so, a position where sometimes there are some things that a government does that are best done without full transparency. But where do we draw the line, right? We've seen examples in the current administration and in the past administration where it seemed as if we were really pushing that line pretty far, that the government didn't have to be transparent about, say, how it was that two people crashed a White House state dinner, right? The executive privilege was used to defend that mistake. And that seemed a little odd, and certainly there are more examples today. So those are just in a quick summation, sort of the three questions that we're after in this chapter: the role of women religious, how we understand justice, and then how we understand our ability as citizens to participate in our own government. The question, of course, has to be asked. All of these pieces were composed, in a, as Mike pointed out, in a vision of the world that was a bit more of a progressive populism, a little bit more positive. Something, let's say, like globalization was unquestioned, right? Now that's a question. Globalization is a question today. And so we have to look at what was contributed here in light of where we are now, and are there things that we can take from these texts? I would certainly suggest that with Barry's text, the continued persistence of the question of transparency, which if we are to be an informed electorate and citizens, we need to know what's going on in our government. We need to know what our government is doing. In 100% of the cases, maybe not, but the burden's on government to explain why they need to be quiet rather than on us to prove why we need to hear their voice. So this becomes the question, can we adopt the same perspective here, sort of the positive vision of the Catholic contribution that Bren offered. Can we still say that when we have one of the chief advisors of the current administration is Catholic? And has a very different vision. If anyone, I don't know if anyone reads the New York Times on a regular basis, but if you do, there was a great piece about Pope Francis and Donald Trump, both grassroots progressives, both grassroots figures that are progressing in sort of their own direction, but yet how do we, part of the link that this article was making was Steve Bannon as the Catholic perspective. So it was an interesting piece. I recommend you look at it. But with that being said, I think maybe I'll pass it back to Mike to come up and talk about Lithuania.
Can you tell us real briefly why you chose the heading Age of Innocence?
The idea behind that was when Mike and I were discussing sort of where the book stood currently, all of the articles, all of the pieces were developed within a sort of global context that really was sort of considering itself in a positive trend. We were all sort of going in a good direction, right? That globalization was an unquestioned positive, that we could work, transnationally without. That we were wondering if that assumption on the part of us as editors and on the part of our scholars was perhaps a little too innocent. Did we need to perhaps were we missing something in our scholarship about what these trends were and where they were going? And so we wanted to sort of raise that for ourselves and for conversation. When we go back to these things, how is it, what can they offer us that we maybe didn't pick up on the first time? And what did we maybe collectively miss that we needed to pay more attention to? Does that get at what you were?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great.
Very helpful.
Not much original sin in those essays.
Niebuhr would not have been.
I do want to make, let's see, one point. The Catholic connection with O'Neill was the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops was doing work on restorative justice, and it looked like that orientation toward criminal justice was becoming identifiably Catholic at that time. And Barry Sullivan rooted his discussion of transparency in the work of John Courtney Murray, who was an advocate for government transparency in the 1950s. So those were the Catholic connections, thinking that this was going to be more fully unfolded. But our question on Age of Innocence, has that unfolding essentially stopped? The conspicuous silence of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops during the last election cycle, kind of an untypical silence, it seems. But in any case, with Lithuania, I'll go quickly here. With Lithuania, the theme for the folks that contributed to our volume had to do with the release and the relief of being out from under Soviet oppression. And they had been 10 years out of their liberation from the Soviet Union at that point. And that was a problem of the past. And it seemed for all of these authors really the past. Russia was not going to be challenging them in the manner in which the Soviet Union had challenged them. But what was in the present for them was dealing with the effects of 50 years of oppression, the social psychological effects. In the case of Anton Streikas, he's a historian at the University in Vilnius, and he did a piece on the importance of the Catholic Church, the historic importance of the Catholic Church in maintaining Lithuanian culture and Catholicism during those years, those 50 years of really terrible oppression. The oppression was overpowering. The propaganda machine in Lithuania was unlike any outside of the Soviet Union. Daily propaganda against the church and against the clergy. The Jesuit church in Vilnius was taken over by the regime, gutted, and made into a museum of atheism. So the side altars had exhibits on the relationship between atheism and political freedom, and the relationship between Catholicism and human oppression. And that was daily fare. School children would be taken through that exhibit. So this was not a light kind of propaganda organization. This was very intense. The church, the Jesuit church at Vilnius University, the old Jesuit church, under the church were the catacombs where the Jesuits had been buried from the 18th century on until the suppression when they were left. But these were sacred, it was a sacred site. When the Soviets came into to Lithuania and put together their steam heating system for the city, they got front end loaders and machinery, and simply raked all of that material out to put those steam pipes under the chapel. And the bones of the Jesuits that had been buried there for 200 years were just strewn out in the street, picked up by garbage trucks and thrown and tossed away. And the KGB would look in cars. They knew when these operations were going to take place. They'd look and see, watch the crowd, who is overreacting to this. If someone starts crying, they're picked up. So you learned, as Anton Streikus and Demetri Delaney talk about, you learn how to live a double life. You become publicly, completely unaffected and kind of a neutral disposition. And maybe inside, in a private place, you can hold your sorrow, but you cannot express your sorrow publicly or you'll be picked up. And we were taken through the prison, the KGB prison in Vilnius that has been restored, so you can go through and see what the horrific tortures that people were suffered for showing emotion against anything that the Soviet regime would do in Lithuania. So in any case, Streikus talks about how the important role that the church had. If you had that double life, and your identity was preserved in that private place, the extent to which you could contact church members and do some secret worshiping to fill up that private place, you could survive. That's the research that Demetri Delaney has done with survivors. She considers Lithuania as a whole, everybody under 40 years old in Lithuania would be suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. And the people that survived the most adequately, and she's a psychologist at University of Vilnius, were those that could continue to engage, find people to worship with in the dark of night. The people that collapsed were the ones who had only their own personal interiority to rely on. And as it went, school children were encouraged to rat out their parents in school. They were, so a parent could not trust their children, a spouse could not trust their wife. Life was completely fragmented and crazy. So many people, their interiority just fractured. Alcoholism rates skyrocketed, suicide rates skyrocketed. When there was the liberation in 1991, it's not as though thousands of people all of a sudden, hooray, and they're healed. You had thousands of severely crippled human beings in that country who were absolutely afraid to respond to the call of democracy, democratic participation. There was no basis for trust. No basis for trust. And in democracy, you need trust, some level of trust. So that was Nerija Putinaitė's conclusion. She was not optimistic about the fate of democracy at that time in Lithuania. And she said, we just don't have a ballast of human beings who are sufficiently intact and trustworthy to participate, to take the risks of participating in democracy. And the church, which was in a sense kind of arrogant about the position that it had in the years of opposing the Soviet regime, and when democracy comes in and there's more liberal abortion laws, there's more liberal laws on same-sex relations, the church is defiant. We are the institution that held up this culture and this civilization for 50 years. Follow us on these moral matters, and that didn't happen. So at this time, for Lithuania, the future, the prospects for democracy were kind of bleak. And the population was hemorrhaging. Young people were leaving Lithuania in droves for Ireland at that time to get work. And I have Russian redo on there because, there, as you know, if you listen to this, there's a new Russian threat in Lithuania. Given Donald Trump's kind of soft relationship to NATO, Lithuania absolutely relies on NATO. They're absolutely terrified by the possibility that Russia could come back. So there is in 2015, they reinstituted conscription. In 2016, they instituted civil defense practices in all the schools. So this is real stuff. They're teaching children what to do if they're invaded. In 2000, as of today, there's something called the Rifleman Union, which is a militia of over 100,000 people that carry weapons and are ready to defend Lithuania if Russia attacks. And interestingly, the current Archbishop of Lithuania, who's actually American-born, UCLA grad, worked for IBM marketing for 5 years, but is now president of the Lithuanian Bishops' Conference and Archbishop of Vilnius. Now this is giving the church an opportunity to return and say, we are your partners in the defense of Lithuania against Russia. We know how to do that. So there's an interesting resurgence of Catholicism, but on the basis of this fear of Russia. I would say not on the basis of trust, or really on the basis of a kind of a healthy democracy, but more on the basis of fear. So that's why the question, is this a return of the Russia kind of paradigm for Lithuanians? And John, we're almost there.
The next section we wanted to talk about is in Indonesia. So Indonesia was an interesting place for us to go and to reflect on these questions, especially the Catholic question, because in Indonesia, this is the world's largest Muslim majority nation. Catholicism is less than 5% of the overall, Catholics make up less than 5% of the overall population. They are very much a minority religion in this particular cultural and political context. And that really does affect the way that Catholics identify and understand themselves as part of the Lithuanian narrative. The Indonesian narrative. I'm still thinking about Russia. What the two threads come through all of these pieces, and they're a little bit, unless you're familiar with Indonesian culture, they might seem a little bit odd. The first is the state philosophy, right? Indonesia, as a nation state, has a philosophy called Pancasila, and it's made up of 5 principles, and these are 5 principles that really frame the way that the national identity of Indonesia gets interpreted by everybody who lives there, across religious and sort of ethnic borders. One element of Pancasila, of this state philosophy, is called, it basically means deliberation. It's called musyawarah. And it is a form of democratic deliberation where decisions are made not from authority figures, but by community discourse, right? A group of people will get together around an issue, they will talk about it, they will express different ideas, and they ultimately have to come to a conclusion about something to do in that community, right? So it's not that there's even a leader of the community who's going to determine. It all comes organically from the community, or at least it should at its best. And so these two themes, both the Pancasila and the musyawarah, are present in all of these pieces that come from our Indonesian colleagues. Baskara Wardaya is a Jesuit, actually did his doctoral work at Marquette, just a little bit north of here. He's a historian, and he tries to trace the history of Indonesia and its identity up until the present. And one of the things that he really focuses on is the role that Catholics played in helping to form Indonesian identity. And it's a very contested colonial legacy. Catholics, through Francis Xavier, for example, finally came to what was the Spice Islands, came to what we now know as Indonesia. Later on, when Dutch East Indian Company came about, they got rid of all the Catholics because they wanted everyone to be Protestant. There were different iterations of religious belief. And in the relatively modern period, the government, after colonial occupation, elected a president who went by the name of Sukarno. And Sukarno was very beloved, and really he was the one who started the Pancasila, the principles. He was very open to religious tolerance. His parents were Muslim and Hindu, and so he absolutely celebrated different religious perspectives. He was critical of the West and their sort of hyper-capitalist movements during the Cold War, which got him in a lot of trouble, and he was replaced eventually by a more authoritarian figure, Suharto. It can be confusing to keep them separate linguistically. Suharto came in and was much more of an authoritarian figure. Religious tolerance was really more of a facade. And so, whereas Catholics were welcome at the table at the beginning of the Indonesian Republic, they all of a sudden became a force of resistance during the oppressive regime of Suharto. And so this is what Bhaskara traces out to try and see, what is the Catholic place in this conversation? Paulus Wirjono was, I believe, the president of the Sanata Dharma University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. And he really develops a piece in which he sort of identifies musyawarah as really the central piece for understanding deliberative democracy in Indonesia, right? And Indonesia, of course, is a democracy by all standards. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we go to Budi Susanto. But he really tries to bring out how it is that musyawarah, this practice of deliberative democracy, begins in the grassroots, begins in local communities, farming communities, advocacy communities, and then rises up, right? This is, in some ways, analogous to sort of, if you're familiar with Catholic social teaching at all, we have the principle of subsidiarity, right? Where you begin in the local communities and it moves up from there. Musyawarah, a little bit, works along similar lines. But because it is sort of a decentralized form of deliberation, it lends itself, unfortunately, to being co-opted. And this is what happens, according to Budi Susanto, this is what happens with the Suharto regime. They co-opt these principles and these visions that are offered by Sukarno, and really turn them into sort of empty categories that Suharto can just use to further his agenda. And so Budi Susanto offers us another form of resistance. And for him, this form of resistance comes through the traditional Japanese art of Cathoprak, which is performing arts. And it is deeply satirical. It pokes fun, as Budi says in his paper. It holds up a funhouse mirror to authority in order to show its flaws and perhaps even reveal the really real behind all the smoke and mirrors. I think that one of this role, and Budi's piece was deeply concerned with this question of culture. The role of culture, I think, really comes through in Budi's piece for the Indonesian context. Cathoprak became a form of public performance where the powerful were mocked. Sometimes with them being aware of it, sometimes it was a little bit too above their head. They couldn't quite, everybody else got it, but the power person in the room would be the one who didn't quite know they were being made fun of. I can't not draw an analogy to what we see today, and let's say with Saturday Night Live, and the work that they do, sort of responding to power. Particularly, think of Melissa McCarthy as Sean Spicer, or Alec Baldwin as President Trump. This form of sort of mocking, not just because they are making fun, but they have a bigger point to make, right? That it exposes the smoke and mirrors that perhaps authority figures are trying to put up, and tries to get at the really real. This is what Cathoprak is doing, and I think that SNL can be an analogous example to that. All along these ideas of how do we deliberate democratically. Now the problem, as you can see with the heading, is that Indonesia is struggling with a reality that many nation-states are facing, which is a huge sort of diaspora of its citizens around the world. Right? I think something like 4.5 to 5 million Indonesians are living outside of Indonesia, working in various places, in various jobs. This creates a problem, as Budi points out, right, for this idea of musyawarah, this idea of deliberative encounter, right, that we make our democratic decisions by coming together as a community meeting. When you can't do that, it creates a problem, and there's been a noted rise in Indonesia of sort of online radicalization of Indonesians, which hadn't really been a problem within this online radicalization, had not been a huge problem for Indonesia prior to sort of, say, the explosion of social media, everything from Twitter to Reddit to Facebook to you name it. But now all of a sudden, these communities of encounter are not happening face to face, and people are beginning to identify sort of in more isolated fashion, separate from the sort of traditional Pancasila vision that Indonesia had, for so many years, sort of prided itself on. And so this is a tension that Indonesia is struggling with now. There has been a noted rise in extremist violence in Indonesia. And a lot of the people involved in this sort of developed their extremist ideology in very isolated terms. It was not, they were not part of a community. They were just sort of by themselves very often because they were working in a variety of jobs overseas. They did not have community to engage them. And this has been something that has been a challenge for not only the government, but also the religious communities, all of them within Indonesia, to sort of make sense of. So that's why we said online radicalism is a contemporary issue that the authors may have been gesturing towards actually in the text, but that really has come to fruition since the publication. But I'll let Mike.
Did such interesting work. I sat with Father Paulus at two of these musyawarah meetings in villages way high in the jungles of Indonesia. And it was so interesting because there's a battle going on as to the degree to which the Muslims will use the madrasa as the schoolhouse for the children. And that the fear there is a fundamentalist kind of Islam being commuted in the madrasa. It's the Jesuits who are trying to help the Muslims retain the traditional Indonesian custom of musyawarah. So in both cases when I was at musyawarah meetings, it's all Muslim elders. With Father Paulus in the center, kind of sitting in the circle, and he's just so admired and loved by the Muslim leaders in the village because they like this idea. It's very democratic, and they want to teach their children this. But it's against these are ironies. Budi Susanto, one little kind of backstory on that one. You know, the Jesuits in the 18th century, one of the media that they used to evangelize was the theater, Jesuit drama. So Budi does make a link here between the Jesuit dramatic tradition and this kind of indigenous Ketoprak. So those are the Catholic connections. Back to the future. So Peru, basic Spanish colonial heritage. And to this day, they're still trying to work themselves outside of that colonialism. The Concordat of 1980 really, for the first time, declared a separation of church and state in Peru, which meant that the old traditions of the church needing to legitimize the regime and the church to receive patronage from the regime, a kind of hydraulic between legitimization and patronage that kept the church really in control of the state over periods of colonization, that is broken. And Soledad talks about that, but broken not in a way that we would recognize in our church-state separation modality. And I'll talk about that just a little more in a minute. Gamio Gary, he talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came out after the defeat of the Shining Path So between 1980 and 2000, there's civil war in Peru with the Maoist shining path. Thousands and thousands of people are killed in a very complex war between the rebels, government militia, and a complicit church. The document that came out exposing the complicity of the church was rejected by the current cardinal in Lima, Cristiani, who's a Opus Dei cardinal, and has completely rejected the results of this report, which implicated the church in hiding some of these atrocities. And the government has not, in a sense, pushed back on Cristiani. Jorge Trellis, the legacy of colonialism in Peru has meant that political participation is weak. It's there, but it's not really religiously. There are about as many evangelicals as Catholics that are involved politically. Catholics aren't any more politically involved than evangelicals. What matters is your socioeconomic level in terms of political participation. You'll be more likely to participate politically if you're in a higher socioeconomic level, less so a religious identification. So that was discouraging, thinking that maybe here in the birthplace of liberation theology, the birthplace of Gustavo Gutierrez, that the Catholic Church would still be maintaining the spirit of liberation theology, but Cardinal Cristiani and a more conservative movement had pretty much evaporated that spirit by the time we got there. And Back to the Future, give you an idea of, this is my last remark, give you an idea of how, from our standard, kind of strange the separation of church and state is in Peru. The Peruvian president, if Cristiani were to suggest that a politician should not be allowed to receive the sacraments if they support abortion, the state would completely reject that and say that's an intrusion of our new separation of church and state. So they could say that, which seems to us ridiculous, I suppose, from a traditional United States understanding of separation of church and state. But at the same time, the president, current president of Kuczynski in Peru, in October, at a National Day of Prayer, consecrated, this is his words, by the authority vested in me, he's president of Peru, I make an act of consecration, the Republic of Peru, to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart of Mary, asking for their intercession in the affairs of the Peruvian state, so that we may use that intercession for our good, always bearing in mind the 10 Commandments. So this is, there's not a problem with this in Peru, that kind of language, which for us would be bizarre if the president got up and said, I'm consecrating the United States to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So they're still working it out in Peru by our standards. All right, so that was just like a very eclectic piece. You know what? This project was not like a road that we followed that was about democracy, Catholicism, and culture, a kind of a thread. It was more like a gem, you know, that just refracted in all kinds of interesting directions. And we didn't try to force some kind of grand conclusion. We just kind of celebrated the uniqueness of each of these people's contributions. And thank you so much for your patience in listening to all this.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes left for questions, so please, Kathy.
Well, I was curious in listening to all this thing about the power struggles and things you were talking about. Did anyone in any of these essays talk about like the things of Gerd Hofstede or Eric Law about these sort of low power distance cultures and the high power distant cultures and how to make sort of things? We talk about democracy, but that's so unequal in itself. And I was curious whether anyone addressed any of those types of things that people have been doing with theology to try to equal out sort of discussions with people of different cultures and all. Or did that not come up at all? nothing of like Eric Law or Gerd Hofstede?
In the case of Lithuania, they were just trying to grope with what democracy could possibly mean after their period of oppression. Indonesia, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus came and talked to us about the absolute value of religious freedom. I thought it was interesting. In a country of 3% Catholics, that was the strongest statement I've ever heard in my life of the value of religious freedom. And the importance of democracy in that sense. So what their reflections were very kind of practical, very kind of rooted, not really engaging the kind of questions in the academy that we're asking
Well,
about.
this has nothing to do with Catholicism. Okay, thank you.
We have a situation here where we talk about religion and versus that secularization, and how much the possibility is for a Catholic expression, or that could lead a person into involvement in questions of democracy. And I think, we can look at Lithuania and say, you see the tremendous friction that there is between somebody coming out and expressing their faith. But I think here we need to deal with this question of secularization, how much we can say that our faith leads us into the concerns that are very large in our government, in our lives, and in our survival, actually.
What was interesting in some of these contexts were how the religious voice, like you bring up Lithuania, another one would be, in Indonesia, that the different secularizations that come into play affecting the different ways that religious voices get spoken and heard. And so the US and Indonesia are the two that come to mind here, that rather than saying it's just sort of a one-to-one Catholic voice versus a secularized voice, what surprised me was the very different ways that secularization played out, right, in these different contexts, the different ways that people understood that term in relation to the religious voice. That was not always, I think if I heard your question, but it was not always antithetical. It was in many cases, it was very complementary. Did I get your question right?
Yeah, well, I think, we can try to see what our Catholicism means in this context that we have, and I think that things that I see coming out of different writers and looking towards how do we express the love or the basic nonviolence of Christ, and how that relates to our position in the whole world, and how we can be involved in that. And that seems to me that's a real challenge that we have here.
Yeah, and I mean, Indonesia really is the example for this, because the authors that we had, many of whom were Jesuits, really themselves, in a way that surprised me, saw themselves as being able to bring the word of Christ, bring their Catholic identity into a context that didn't sort of assume what they assumed, and they were able to be prophetic in that. The difficulty came when that religious tolerance became more of a sort of a facade than an actual practice. Then it became a problem. But while religious tolerance and pluralism was celebrated in Indonesia, you really had a number of Jesuits coming, in particular in this book, Jesuits coming into public discourse and being able to sort of offer their perspective as themselves, rather than sort of a non-religious version of their religion. But they were very welcome in the conversation. That is what's contested these days. So yeah.
In the Lithuanian context, if you suggested to a Lithuanian Catholic that the proper approach to Russia is nonviolent action, they would say, had we taken that approach during Soviet oppression, we would be annihilated. We wouldn't exist. So the present Archbishop of Lithuania from Vilnius is the military militia chaplain. So it's so context-based, you know.
We got one more question?
Yeah, on the point about Russia redo, has there been, at least my understanding, the Soviet behavior toward Lithuanian religious countries that had religion, which were in their satellites? Russia, hasn't it changed also with the tolerance of religion and just the sheer number of practicing Catholics or Eastern Orthodox within Russia, where this tension should maybe be mitigated? I mean, I don't see Russia today being the same Russia that today's Lithuanians are afraid of. Russia has probably evolved. Well, I don't want to use the word evolved. Russia has had an acceptance of religion within their own political system. Is that an accurate conclusion?
They look at.
Is it just so?
They look at they've got, remember up there, they've got Kaliningrad to the west, which is a Russian state. They're sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Russia. And they've actually got a 130-mile border that they're building a wall, a 2-meter high wall on that border right now, kind of a Trump wall. But they feel they're sandwiched between Russia, and they say, look at what happened to Crimea, look at what happened to Ukraine. We have to be really on our ready, because this could happen to us. Latvia and Estonia, they think this is all fake. There is no Russian threat. But they're a very small Catholic population in those two states. Lithuania is different, and they're very afraid.
But is it anti-Catholic or is it just political? I mean, I can understand.
Yeah, no, it's not anti-Catholic.
Okay,
no.
great. That's why.
Yeah, no, it's
Okay, so
absolutely political.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, Francis has an announcement before we.
Yes, actually, here at the center we only organize interesting events. So after your spring break, we have another event on love, joy, and sex, reflections on Pope Francis on Amoris Laetitia. It's on March 30th. It's a Thursday evening. On the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, we're organizing the annual World Catholicism Week on Ecumenism. You have this here on the gallery in my name, Ecumenism in the World Church. And then also, can you please let us know how good we are by filling this out? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you for Mike and John again.